As much as I'd like to finish this roof today, I got some gardening that has to be done. Food preparation can't wait. Obviously, winter's coming, so I got pondering like I normally do about history, and I got thinking about how when this gun building shop is finished, it can kind of be an extension of our small tavern that we built. And I got thinking about two things today. One was the important role that taverns played in the 18th century, and also how over time we have lost the ability for civil discourse and proper conversation. It was almost a taught thing at the time. Their speech was far more eloquent than our speech of the 21st century. Anyway, those are some things I think I might chat about, and then I got to get some gardening done. So here we are at the Cedar Hollow Tavern. In today's world, we think of a tavern as a place just to go for recreation. It is a gathering or a meeting place, but they played a much more essential role in the 18th century. In fact, so much so that people didn't really think of distances. They didn't think of the distance in miles from Quebec to Montreal or New Haven to Boston. They thought about how many tavern stops they would have en route. I'm going to get into what the travel was like between them, and it wasn't pleasant if we think about the quality of the roads at the time and the means of transportation. But if it was more than 10 miles walk, it's something a person could do to a village and home again, perhaps in a day. But when it was further than that, then you would have a spot such as this where you could take your leisure. The important role is that in the time period, they weren't just a place for food and drink, although that could be had. They were a place where commerce took place, business meetings. Politicians would meet there. They were auction centers. They played a whole gamut, but they were the place where one would get their information. And if you really wanted to know what was going on in the vicinity or with current events, one need only talk to the mistress of the house or the owner, the master of the tavern. And because they took it all in, they were there for all the different people that would come by and spread their, we call it gossip today. I'm going to have a sit down. It's been a wee bit hot today, and speaking of hot, someone once asked me at a reenactment, he says, how do you guys stand it? It's hot today in those clothes. And I'm thinking, well, are you hot? And the answer would be yes. And the bottom line is, in the 18th century, they were a lot smarter on coping with heat. So a light linen shirt like I'm wearing today, especially one with as many holes as this one's got in it, is far cooler than most fabrics that people wear in our modern world. Now I'm going to have a sit down. So when I was up on the roof, I think I said used the term that the conversation was taught. I think it went beyond that. I think in that time period it was actually an art form. And I remember my mother telling me with the advent of radio that her father said to her, that's the end of conversation as we know it. And then as inventions come along, we have the television, we have and we get to the point where we now have lost that. We short form things, we carry a box around with us, and we truly have lost the art or ability to converse with people. So back to people traveling from tavern to tavern. This was a high point of the day, and the coach lines that would transport people, they didn't arrive every day, but when they did, it was a highlight for the village or people in the surrounding area. So people would get settled in, they would be given their lodgings, and as the evening progressed, one by one, the local people would start to filter into the tavern for a mug of flip, or other concoctions. Flip, before I go any further, flip is a concoction made from beer or ale, rum, eggs, butter, and molasses. And they'd mix this concoction out. And I've never tried it. I just kind of prefer my single malt scotch if I'm going to have a libation. But they mix this up, and then they had the thing called a flip iron, which was like a poker, but its sole purpose was to put it in the coals, get it red hot, then dip it into this concoction that would cause it to froth up, and then the proprietor of the tavern would disperse it into the tankards of the patrons. So I'm going to have to try flip. Maybe even have to try to make some here at the Cedar Hollow Tavern, just to say I've done it, and a little bit of history. So yeah, travel. If we think about travel at the time, we take a lot for granted in our modern world. Imagine a stagecoach in that time period. And again, the 1750s that Kathy and I portray is during what they called the mini ice age. So I've mentioned this before, but winters were much colder than they are today. Snows were much deeper. And I visualize myself being in a coach on a very rough road, feeling like you were on a ship at sea. The wind is swirling the snow around you. The horses are plowing through drifts. And you finally arrive at this, let's call it an oasis, called a tavern in the middle of nowhere. You get out, you stretch your legs. But the only thing to keep you warm inside that carriage would have been however many blankets you owned or the proprietor of the coach could supply. So travel was certainly difficult. Now, as far as the fare one would receive, it ran the gamut. But we call it stew today, but at the time it was simply called pottage, which today means stew. But they would have this pottage, sometimes would be the same pot of stew for months, sometimes years, sometimes decades. In doing some research, I found there was a pub or a tavern in France dating back to the late 1600s, and they had the same pot of pottage stewing right up until the Second World War, where they could no longer get the ingredients for it. So you'd take a ladle and you'd scoop out to one of your patrons a big old bowl of this pottage, and then you'd add stuff back into the pot and just keep it simmering. It's worth noting that an establishment like this was essentially a place for men. Now, it was quite common to have what they called the mistress of the tavern who attended the bar, and there may be servants that, with ill-fitting clothes and barefoot that scrubbed the tavern floors and such. But for women to travel in that period alone without a male escort, a father or a brother or some form of protection was very, very unusual. There's from a diary of a Catherine Farnham in 1773. She talks about, "I was in great distress upon entering the public house, for there was no one there to protect me." Now, I don't think they were, this was a period of gentlemanry, and I don't think they were as much at risk as they thought, but it was just a practice that was unheard of at the time. These establishments also played a role during military campaigns. So it was a place where during the French and Indian Wars, people would gather to find out, what were the movements of the indigenous people or their opposing enemy, what would their numbers were. They would plan strategy in these structures. There was one in Lexington owned by a William Monroe. Now, Monroe was actually the orderly sergeant for Captain Parker of the militia for during the American Revolution. And I can't remember the fellow's last name. I'll just call him John. John shows up at the tavern at 6:30 the night before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And he reports seeing a large troop of British moving. That was around 6:30 in the day. The following morning before light, a large force of British infantry arrive, and in a few hours the first shots that will start that 8-year conflict happen in the common ground of or what they call the common ground in the town of Lexington. So that very afternoon at Lexington, Colonel Hughes, with his 1,000-man reinforcement, actually occupied the Monroe Tavern. They drink copious and liberal amounts of food, or they consume the food. They drink copious amounts of libations, and then at that point, about an hour and a half, they're in the tavern. They're kicked out. They convert the tavern into a field hospital. So taverns have a lot of history. If taverns could only talk, the tales they could tell. It's going to be a number of years later, I believe it's 1789, that George Washington himself visits and stays a couple of nights in the Monroe Tavern. I think the table that he sat at is still there, or so I've heard. And that's one of a number of taverns in the American colonies that has been totally restored to its original condition. One can visit it to this day and actually sit at a table that George Washington sat at. Anyway, I digress. I've got gardening to do. I wish I could just keep building, but yeah, we have company coming for dinner and we got to pick some vegetables. Before I get to my gardening, I'll leave you with a quote. It's one of my favorites. It strikes a chord with me. It says, "You can't change history, but it could change you." So in my life, I found history to be, well, it obviously is a passion of mine, but yeah, do a little reading, do a little watching. History can be fun.